This essay example, as well as thousands of others, is available in text format on our website for free and without registration. Simply Google Ivy Panda Free Essays.
Introduction. Roman history originated and unfolded from intensive contact with Greek culture. This contact was necessitated by the expansion of the Roman Empire and the extension of Roman diplomacy and army. The constant contact between the Romans and the Greeks assimilated and completely induced them to Greek literature and art. Several aspects of Greek culture originated from Rome and straight from the services of Greek-speaking slaves. There existed private tutors in the household of the wealthy class who were hired to teach culture. Roman history copied a lot from the Greeks, but they had their models that could inspire their historiography. According to the Romans and the Greeks, narratives of history could not be subjected to scholarly inquiry, and their understanding lay on ancient literature. The historiography context of the Romans is quite distinct from the Greek one. Oral tradition. The Greek historiography began with oral tradition, whereas that of the Romans was based on annals and Pontifex Maximus, which were recorded. The Annals Maxim contained a lot of information like religious documents, names of consuls, and death of priests, and all the disasters which happened throughout history. An example of Annales Maximi was the Tabulae Ulbatae, which carried information about the origin of the Republic. The founder of Roman historiography was Quintus Fabius Pictor. The historical inquiry of the Romans followed two main traditions, the annalistic tradition and the monographic tradition. In the Roman Empire, two languages were employed, Latin and Greek. Several historical writers of both Greek and Roman emerged from the circles which were defined as senatorial or equestrian depending on their political or administrative functions. There was a formulaic basis in Republican Rome which formed a basis of historical composition. The previous or past events were narrated in line with the annual consulship, which was the highest political office in Rome. Chronicles. Romans considered the chronological principle as fundamental, and they could modify and refine depending on thematic considerations. Their narratives were characterized by the annalistic principle, and it was measured in annus, which was equivalent to a year in Latin. Traditionally, historiography is closely linked with ethnography and did not only dwell on Greek history but also the history of other people. The Greeks were not united as a state, and hence it was difficult to narrate the past of a political state, so it was only the history of individual states that was narrated. In Greek, historians used chronicles which were ascribed to mythical authors and later edited by men. They applied logographic, which carried information beyond written records. The Christian historiography eroded the ideals of the past, and it was spearheaded by Eusebius of Caesarea. Christianity superseded paganism. The Christian historians applied chronicles as their mode of historical inquiry. The Muse. Roman history can be understood based on geographical and historical principles. The first form of writing by the Romans was in Latin. The Greeks assigned Clio, which is one of the Muses. According to them, muses brought joy and were meant to teach and entertain. They valued pressure and instructions. Muse was an artful skill, and it consisted of a language and a world of sounds. It carried a lot of value and attachment easily attached to the literary works in antiquity. It is historically noticed that in Roman history there are 8 genres, and the most conspicuous one was the one represented epic in prose. The drama with Roman history is that just like how one finds in historical narratives, the sequence and serious events have been composed in line with the climax called peripeteia, which means the reversal of fortune and catastrophe. Speeches. The writings of Greek historians are heavily latent in speeches. This implies that they cannot be delivered in the original form of how it was reported. In this context, there existed no handouts aimed at describing the contents. Also, in references to speeches, the historians used their languages and never used that of the speakers. Speeches played a crucial part in the historical work, and the lack of handouts meant that there was no accurate representation of what was said, but what was put down by the historians in the form of recorded speeches was considered a fundamental part of historical inquiry. The speeches were a reflection of the background and an explanation of the characters, motives, and objectives of the core participants. The speeches form a good historical picture, and the origins of the speech lay in Homeric epic. Narratives. The Jews and Christian historiographers utilized providential narratives starting with the history of creation. These narratives mattered because they hinted at something important in the future and demonstrated connectedness. Following the history of the French Revolution and colonization in Africa and Asia, the Romans and the European historians published narratives that resituated the place of Europe in world history. The Greek cultures, religion, and politics were presented and preserved in the form of narratives. The historical inquiry of the Greeks was characterized by several dynamics. The intellectual revolution has opened up a new wave of energy into the field of historical inquiry. In ancient Greece, historical writings were in the form of traditional poems. People wrote about the problems that afflict human existence in poem form before the art of recording was realized. Poetry treated an epic theme, and it was also used to recount the deeds of heroes. The use of poetry was criticized by Thucydides when he argued that poetry was not a perfect medium that can be used to transmit reality, since it was bound to exaggerate history. Homeric epics were considered by the Greeks as a fascinating and useful tool of history. It was particularly aimed at educating the youth. The artistic creations of the epic influenced historical inquiry in Greek. The artistic impressions of the gods, languages, and heroes created an impression and appreciation of the past. In the context of speech and poems, they enhanced reverence to the listeners and created memories and records of the past, and acted as connections to the past. Conclusion. The Greek, Roman, and Christian historiography utilized several modes of historical inquiry, which included narratives, chronicles, poems, and speeches. Though they varied based on their originators and how history was preserved, they shared the above tools of historical inquiry. Christian history was preceded by the period of intellectual revolution, and it marked the beginning of better approaches to historiography. Poetry and speeches were considered instrumental. The bards recited about past tales through rhythmic speech, which followed strict patterns. If you want to find more works like this compare and contrast essay on early Greek, Roman, and Christian historiography, head over to ivypanda.com. It has a collection of free samples with thousands of submissions covering virtually all academic subjects. No registration required to access it.